Greetings. I'm Alpa Nawre, a member of the Alumni Council of the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And on behalf of the Harvard Graduate School of Design Alumni Council, I am delighted to welcome you all to the third volume of the Design Impact Speaker Series, South Asia, Design Agency and Climate Change. South Asia is home to 1/4 of the world's population, a complex and diverse region which is woefully underserved by designers. Today, we will hear from powerful and insightful voices from Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka as we deliberate on the rich possibilities for design thinking and agency, even as we take stock of the existing crises of unmet needs and conflicting interests in this context. It is my pleasure now to introduce and invite Peter Coombe, who is the chair of the Alumni Council of the Harvard Graduate School of Design and founding partner of Sage & Coombe Architects. Peter Coombe.
Thank you, Alpa. The Alumni Council is the representative body of Harvard University's Graduate School of Design's global community of alumni. Last September, in response to the pandemic and necessary isolation, we launched Design Impact, a global design leadership speaker series. The mission of Design Impact is to reach beyond borders and silos, to challenge all of us as a collective community to use design as a tool for actionable, transformative change and healing. To that end, I am thrilled to share with you that more than 2,200 people from more than 70 countries have registered for this event. These numbers are evidence of the significance of today's topic and echo the urgency we all collectively feel. And now it is my profound honor to introduce an acclaimed academic, architect, and author, Professor Rahul Mehrotra, the chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Design, and the John T. Dunlap Professor in Housing and Urbanization at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He is also the founding principal of RMA Architects. Professor Mehrotra.
Thank you, Peter. Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion, South Asia Design Agency and Climate Change. I can't tell you, Peter, how thrilled I was when you told me that the Alum Council was going to focus on South Asia. And so I commend you and the Council for bringing sort of to this discussion a non-US centric critical issue. And I think that shift is really welcomed. In fact, this introduction and discussion around issues that relate more broadly to the global South, or the description I prefer to use of the majority world, a term coined by Shahidul Alam, the activist and photographer from Bangladesh, to describe where the majority of the world's population resides. And I think it is perhaps more relevant to replace this, the developing world or the third world with the majority world, because it's sort of much more an accurate description. But more importantly, I think these definitions, like the category of megacities, are human-centric in their metrics because they place the human being at the center of the imagination as opposed to the global city, the world city, etc., which use power and capital as indicators or metrics to construct those categories. And so to respond to accommodating, and so they therefore respond to accommodating capital and its intrinsic impatience rather than people, especially the ones that are less powerful, the poor and underrepresented. So given all that, I think this is very timely. I must congratulate the students for having picked two robust frameworks to contain the discussion. One to interrogate urbanization and what it might mean for the majority world, and what does even urban mean in the context of South Asia, I think is a very critical question. And then the question of new formations in terms of densities and their relationship to geographies, etc. This is very particular in South Asia, where the combination of densities and skewed investments and often inhospitable terrains are creating perhaps unseen ways that settlements aggregate and are networked through the flow of people, resources, albeit sometimes on a temporal scale. So for example, the Indo-Gangetic Plain Belt is an example of this contiguous settlement pattern that defies any easy definition of what is urban or what is rural. In fact, this binary is going to completely collapse or blur in the context of South Asia, especially. And that's why I think bringing the South Asian countries together to discuss this is really a brilliant move. Because climate change, the displacement resulting from what is going to make for the combination of slow and quick disasters, making the temporal scale even more critical in our planning imaginary. Climate change resulting disasters and displacements are going to threaten livelihoods, even lives, and make the crisis more palpable and immediate and urgent. So we have to equip ourselves to respond to these conditions. This flux, or the urbanization of flux, is something we are totally unprepared for. With flux, we'll have to be careful we don't make permanent solutions sometimes for temporary problems. This flux we have started experiencing will result in new formations, even more challenging to manage and respond given the current frameworks that we use, often borrowed from the West. And so it's very important for you to be doing this also in the context of the GSD, as this is an incredibly important, it has an incredibly important bearing on pedagogy. New urban theory must necessarily emerge from the Indian, Latin American, African, Chinese conditions, in short, from the majority world, where there is action on the ground, or really where the ground is shifting. Instead, we are applying theory that has emerged from the industrializing West from the early part of the last century to understand the planning of our terrains, our cities. This is a problem. Theory is about making sense and creating frameworks for action based on feedback from action on the ground. And so pedagogy has to urgently address these questions. What is the appropriate pedagogy for the majority world? I hope our discussions will begin to open up and address these questions. I'm particularly heartened that you have, within this framing, asked the question of the agency of design. This is very critical because we have to find ways that our spheres of concern, which we articulate, intersect with our spheres of influence. That is, we go beyond the critical to the propositional, and I think confront the question of the agency of design. So congratulations on doing that and addressing these particular questions. And the speakers you have are incredible. I know two of them well. The rest I hope I'll get to know. Ustad Arif Hasan have chosen. He's one of the pioneers in terms of practice in the South Asian context, who's championed these questions for decades now. And of course, Kazi or Khalid Ashraf is a friend and a contemporary, and through his work in the Bengal Foundation, he has also demonstrated how you can make design instrumental, both in the academy through a critical framework, but on action on the ground. So I welcome all the speakers and really congratulate the stellar students who've been moderating the different sessions. Best wishes once again to the Alum Council for focusing and congratulations for focusing your discussions on South Asia and for giving me the time to share my thoughts. So thank you very much and best wishes for the next discussions. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Professor Mehrotra, and for orienting us to what follows. As we get ready to dive into the weeds, a few housekeeping notes for the audience. The event is being recorded, and the recording will be available later on the Design Impact website. The event is organized into 2 sessions, each with short presentations followed by a moderated discussion, and an audience question and answer session immediately following that. For those who are on Zoom, please do ask your questions through the Q&A function. The chat function is also available to you to share your thoughts with all the attendees throughout the event. Those on Facebook and YouTube can simply post your comments. And without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce to you the curator of the first session, which is Global Orientations and Local Perspectives. Seetha Raghupathy is an architect and urban designer with more than 13 years of experience in project design and delivery across India, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Myanmar, and USA. She runs her own practice and is also a senior consultant for the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the Cities Project with the National Institute of Urban Affairs, India. Seetha Raghupathy.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. It is my privilege to curate the first of 2 panels today on global orientations and local perspectives. Over the last few decades, rapid urbanization and resource constraints has necessitated a conceptual shift in the planning practice. Traditional notions of aesthetics, modernization, and efficiency have had to be rethought within the pressing needs and constraints of economic growth, inclusion, and alleviating poverty. These conflicting rationalities and consequent contestations that arise have created a unique urban context in South Asian development and its discourse. Further, increase in local knowledge production and scholarship has allowed a critical re-examination of prevalent authoritative American and European notions of a desirable city. A sharp focus on the socio-economic, cultural, and political underpinnings have placed the survival efforts of the urban poor at center stage. Thus, theoretical underpinnings and planning systems that have hitherto been inherited or adapted from colonial practices have come into sharp focus and close scrutiny. The evolving nature of the society versus state dynamics and the increasing significance in participatory planning has also challenged traditional power relations in the South Asian development landscape. At the same time, wider imperatives of environmental crises and climate change have never been more pressing. Have these dynamic conditions and interesting juxtapositions created a role for design to claim its stage at the center of South Asia's urban transformation? Through this panel, we hope to unravel the depth of inquiry and the degree of success in balancing global orientations with local perspectives and see if the experience offers lessons learned to solve universal problems. As design and planning is a complex, interconnected, multi-stakeholder pursuit, we bring together a myriad set of perspectives across a theoretician, a planner, a development partner, an activist, and a bureaucrat to unpack their preoccupations in creating a development landscape that imbibes good lessons from the global north while ensuring sustainable, just, and equitable cities in the decades to come. With this introduction, I pass it on to Naksha, who will be moderating the session. Naksha Satish is a current student at the GSD and an India Design Leadership Fellow. She's worked in government and private institutions in multiple South Asian cities. Her interests lie at the intersection of housing, technology, and urban design. Over to you, Naksha.
Thank you, Seetha, for that generous introduction. Good morning to everyone from South Asia, and a very good evening to ones on the other side of the globe. I'm delighted to be your moderator for this session on global orientations and local perspectives. And without much ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for today. We have with us Professor Khaleed Kazi Ashraf, who currently heads the Bengal Institute of Architecture, Landscape and Settlements in Dhaka, Bangladesh. After his education at the MIT, he straddled across many roles in academia as well as field of practice. He has authored several publications, including Designing Dhaka, a manifesto for a better city. I invite Professor Ashraf to share with us his theorem for understanding urbanism in a deltaic geography. Professor Ashraf, the stage is yours.
Okay. And I suppose I've got 5 minutes, 30 seconds for this, right? And I've heard about like shotgun wedding. This is a shotgun presentation. Lindsay, you can start counting the time from now. The city is the biggest challenge of our times. And this is made more so at a time of what is otherwise a robust economy. I find this ironic. Conventional planning practices don't work anymore. To arrive at what I call Bengali urbanism, in the case of Bangladesh, I think we have to enter a new imaginative practice. We need to change the narrative on cities. Cities in South Asia, for most part, continue to be defined and described in a crisis mode. For too long, the discourse of cities has been ruled by economic, statistical, or technocratic parameters through the term urbanization. The term is limiting in understanding the city in its fullest potential. So I prefer to bring a twist here with the term urbanism. The city is a social fact. The city is a culture and existential form. Reorienting ourselves from the entrenched sense of the city as chaos and crisis I think we need to see the city as a beautiful thing. Human innovation we should live through together. Now, I recall here Jamie Lerner in this case. No town is an island. Each and every town is integrally linked, in the case of Bangladesh, to a network of flows of people, information, economy, and geographic conditions. And no matter what urban plans we make, they become limited without addressing a larger regional context. How to understand the region? A river runs through each and every town in Bangladesh. This is fundamental. And each river is a part of a vast deltaic ecology, which translates into a network of flows. And I describe this as a kind of terra aquas regime. And urbanism in Bangladesh has to be conceptualized from the hydrological property of the delta. Any physical planning should begin from the premise that a river constitutes a vast ecosystem even when it engages a city or town, and that rivers are conditions of a water flow. Water is paradoxical also. The oscillation between dry and wet creates shifting conditions of habitation and occupation, and I might say, ideologies also. Terra firma cannot be promised. What we are left with is a terra aqua. Water also requires a new theoretical orientation in design and planning when water asks for a new design intelligence. Rivers have riverbanks. Rivers are not only crucial in the ecological and hydrological matrix, but it provides a natural condition for an enriched public realm in the form of riverbanks. Developing riverbanks as public spaces should be an unconditional priority. What you see here are some projects that at the Bengal Institute we're developing in terms of creating a design language as well as a design guideline for different riverbanks. And I can't go into the details here, from on the left from Sylhet, on the right to Rajshahi on the Ganges River. And the other thing is like there are different kinds of waterness. It's not like one essential kind. A city like Dhaka is surrounded by a rich terra aquas floodplains and wetlands. The problem is there's a constant battle between the ecological obligation in preserving the floodplains and the converse economic pressure for invasive development. Landfilling and gradually diminishing of the terra aquas zones characterize a ruthless development patterns. A middle ground can be found. So what we're trying to do here at the Institute is to create a new typology of urban forms that can frame the floodplains, which will help conserve the floodplain as it is, and also create a new kind of spatial architectural form as a kind of a belt. I feel we have lost touch with the critical element that makes for a humanistic and civic experience of a city, public spaces. And I feel very strongly about it. There is no public discourse or investment initiative on public spaces. No matter what beautiful buildings, enormous infrastructures, and swanky developments that happens, an experiential and human city is made possible by public spaces. The global pandemic has ushered in new urgency around public health and strong need for public spaces in the city. I emphasize the street as a neglected public space, which in the case of South Asia is not only a public space, it's a civic landscape and is also part of the ecology of the city. Housing and city form a reciprocal relationship. In Dhaka, there is no suitable housing for residential models for the many different communities that inhabit. Standard planning practices take up a huge, say, wetland or spaces like that and landfill that and make plots and individual buildings. We have tried to reject that idea and bring up new kind of models where the pockets of wetlands and floodplains that I just showed you earlier, they can be retained and saved from encroachment by actually building a ring-line development around it. I believe that small towns in South Asia, for most part, are under-discussed. The urban discourse is primarily around well-known metropolises. We need to give special attention to small towns, and we actually need a new vocabulary to understand the physiology of small towns before taking development actions. And a small town is not a mini-me of the big city. It's its own ontology. A small town is also an ecology. And while working on what we call the Dhaka nexus, what you see here on the lower, the diagram, we looked at 28 towns in the orbit of Dhaka, and we realized that small towns can be diverse in nature and scale. And in generating new incentives in small towns, the first thing to understand is the scale of things, the cluster of buildings, the shapes and materiality, the characters, and the overall quality of life. There's another dear topic of mine, the relationship between agriculture and the city. I've come to realize that agriculture need not be in opposition to the city, which has been historically and conceptually. We are working on the idea that Bengali urbanism can overcome this historic and conceptual opposition. And this opposition is usually played out around the edge of the city, this sort of the emerging or sort of engulfing city into the sensitive landscapes. In Dhaka, a vast area, 29% is categorized as agricultural land. And this poses a dilemma to metropolitan development, how to deal with this land in the metropolitan planning, how to bring agriculture within the folds of the city. City making is, I don't have to emphasize this, collaborative and cumulative. With the city as the challenge, I've expanded my notion of architecture into what you might call the large scale, the urban design, landscape design. And I've been told many times that urban design is not a rocket science, yes, but it's also certainly a political science. It works in its own pace and its own process of mediation and conversation. Let's see if I can I go back to the last slide? I just want to end with something, if I may. Or am I done?
Professor Ashraf.
Right. Right. I just want to end with this. I'm showing you the various kind of things that we have been doing, exhibitions. And in the last slide is actually doing a big public meeting. And you can perhaps see a photograph of me with a lady who is the mayor of a town that we are working with. But what I want to point out is the letter on the right, which citizens from a town that we're working with in Manikganj, and I'll just read a few lines from that.
Professor Ashraf,
dear architect.
Okay. I'm so sorry to intervene. Thank you very much for sharing these exciting views, and especially the lens of urbanism to broaden our approach to cities. We'd love to hear from you longer in the moderated discussion, but I'll quickly move ahead to our next speaker for today. We have with us the erudite and versatile Mr. Arif Hasan from Karachi. He has contributed to the realm of urban development in Pakistan through many roles of an architect, planner, teacher, social researcher, and even an activist. He's the founder and the chairperson of Urban Resource Center in Karachi. He's the recipient of the country's most prestigious Hilal-e-Imtiyaz Award, and also recognized by the Japanese government and the UN for the Year for the Shelterless Memorial Award. I invite Professor Hasan to share his propositions and practice stories with us. Professor Hasan, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, first of all, for having invited me. It's a privilege being here. Can I have my slides? Yeah. Well, I'll be talking about how various planning proposals and implementation at different stages, at different levels, contribute to inequity. They contribute to marginalization, further marginalization of poor communities. First of all, it's the real estate that is destroying the ecology of the region. I show here a development called Perera town, which is, I have superimposed that settlement over this development over the Manhattan. This has been done by someone who's studying here in the US, Rida Khan. It's her map. Now, this has displaced 2,800 villages. What happened to the villagers who were displaced from here is something that has yet to be understood, where they went, what happened to them. Another place called Bandar Island with 3,500 hectares of mangroves and lots of cultural sites and folklore is planned to be taken over and developed as a city, 50 million billion US dollars project. Now, in both these cases, they have led to the creation of people's movement. In the first case is the indigenous people's movement. In this case, second case of the Bandar Island, it is opposition by a large network to this. There are other issues also. This is Karachi Beach, a section of Karachi Beach, where you could sit down, hire a chair and sit down in the water and wet your feet. You could have your head massaged next. You could have yourself photographed with this background and send your photograph to the tribal areas, to your family, saying you were in Japan. You could hire binoculars and watch the ships. Can we go on? Yeah. You could ride camels, you could shoot at Indian and Pakistani film stars. And then came the city government, removed all this and built this wonderful park. All attempts to make them integrate what was happening here before were failures. Now, this is exactly the type of planning that is carried out in most cities. Can we go on? Then there was the attempt to build this real estate along the beach, which meant taking the beach away from the fishermen and from the citizens of Karachi. A Save the Coast movement was launched. It was successful. It was able to stop this project from going ahead. It was a big movement, involved almost all sections of society, especially the fishing communities and academia. Civil society protests meant forums at different levels, and there were massive fishermen's rallies against the project. So it came to a stop, at least for the time being. So at every level, when these projects take place, there is opposition to them. And some movement takes place and some organization is created. So these are positive aspects, but the negative aspects are that this development all the same goes on. This is an iconic building in Karachi. Around it, there were about 2,000 shops and 4,000 hawkers. They were removed. This is what it is like today in limbo as to what is going to happen to it. This is what the government wishes to do. This is what the hawkers and the architects whom they consulted planned, that these places that you see, the low buildings, this is where 800 shops and hawkers could have been accommodated. There was lobbying for this, but unfortunately, the plan was not accepted, and we do not know what is going to happen to this area. In this, the fault lies with the conservationists who are really interested in fossilizing this whole building complex and the areas around it. So there is a very serious issue here, which I will come to. Can we go to the next slide? Now, what are the constraints in pro-people planning? First is the culture of the ruling elite and politicians. There is unbridled capitalism and support to the developers by the state and international financial institution policies which come with their loans. There is the power of the bureaucracy over local governance institutions. There is the absence of proper planning, mapping, knowledge, and working class connections of major civil society organizations. There is a dependence of academia on first world literature and planning theories, which increases the distance between teaching and reality. And this is a very serious issue in our case. Now, these are the constraints, but the most important thing to understand is how do you remove the constraints to the constraints? And that is something that most of our work today in Karachi, in the work of my office and organization, is around the removal of these constraints. These are the constraints, but how do you remove them? So you need people's mapping, you need a different kind of research, you need large-scale networking, and you need 3 levels of advocacy. That is with the people, with communities, with civil society, and through them with the policymakers. And this is the work of the Karachi Urban Resource Center. That is what we try to do, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. Well, thank you very much for asking me to present.
Thank you, Professor Hasan, for reiterating the significance of being responsive to people, even through top-down planning processes. Now we have with us someone who can broaden this perspective further. It's my privilege to invite the seasoned practitioner, Mr. Kenichi Yokoyama, the Director General of the South Asia Department of the Asian Development Bank. He oversees the operations of 7 sector divisions and 6 country offices and plans for regional cooperation initiatives in the entire South Asian region. Prior to ADB, he worked for the government of Japan for 16 years. I invite Mr. Yokoyama to share with us his challenges of working across the entire subcontinent. Mr. Yokoyama.
Thank you, Naksha, for this opportunity. I'm Kenichi Yokoyama of ADB. Let me just highlight what I want to convey in this panel. I have a slide, page 2. So I just would like to say something about urbanization in Asia, challenges and opportunities, and how ADB is approaching this urbanization issue. And thirdly, the kind of a differentiated approach we are taking in various countries, depending on socio-economic conditions. And lastly, a couple of words about knowledge and collaboration. So first point on urbanization challenges and opportunities, page 4. I just want to say that Asia is rapidly growing, and this rapid economic transformation primarily comes from urban areas. So about 80% of economic growth is driven by urban areas, and this is expected to be so. So in the next generation, supporting the smooth and livable urban area development, providing environment for productive activities for the economic development is extremely important. And then slide 5, 6, 7, we talk about a lot of, there's a mounting pressure to do this. Slide 5 talks about, rapid urban, rapid population growth and congestion. Slide 6 about infrastructure deficit on water, sanitation, solid waste and wastewater. And then slide 7 on environmental degradation, air pollution, and so on and so forth. So overall, slide 8, the South Asia requires about 2% of GDP invested in urban development, whereas the present condition is just about 0.5%. So the first message is a huge financing and institutional gap to address the urbanization challenges. And the next point is ADB's approach. Slide 10. We are prioritizing as a corporate strategy on building urban cities. And slide 11, we have 3 key elements to support this. Left-hand side of 11 is one is expanding basic infrastructure and urban services like water, sanitation, transport. And second key element is promoting more systematic urban planning and development, with mobilizing municipal resources. And third is, of course, the environmental improvement and the climate change and disaster resilience. And slide 12, we just want to emphasize on the importance of urban planning. We envision that Asia's urban growth will be transformed in the future from this horizontal sprawling from vertical development in more concentrated areas. This can reduce the cost of infrastructure, cost of services, and also this can generate a lot of revenue through property tax and development sales and so on and so forth. So that's important. We don't have to totally transform, but at least the newly developed area needs to be developed like this in most circumstances. And next slide, please. Then we would like to just touch on how we approach these urban challenges in the different country contexts. And slide 14 presents, we have a mounting constraints or impediments. It's not only finance, it's institutional, it's also governance related and social kind of issues. So we need to tackle all these problems in a systematic way. And the next slide, we try to kind of take a differentiated approach depending on the circumstances, low income country, middle income, upper middle income, island nations, and fragile and conflict affected areas. And I'll touch on several examples. One is next slide, low-income circumstances, Dhaka. This is a conventional programs of poorly performing water utility, not providing access, poorly quality with high loss and in terms of water as well as finance. And LB assistance has so far been able to transform this water utility. Next slide. It's one of the best performing water utility in developing Asia. So 24-hour, 7-day access to 5 million people, including poor people, and also reducing the loss from 40% to 5%, and utility starting to generate profit. So this is a kind of model that we like to promote and replicate in other parts of South Asia for lower income countries. And then next slide shows more middle income circumstances. This is Andhra Pradesh in India. We are supporting the policy reforms for industrial urban development, as well as investment for the integrated urban infrastructure like transport, water, and other wastewater treatment, and so on and so forth. Next slide, this project also includes this systematic urban land use planning. This attracts the private investors in terms of industries and real estate to come in and build infrastructure. And this enables the municipalities to generate a lot of revenues through property tax, development cess, and so on and so forth. And this enables the generation of the fund that can be used for the next kind of generation of investments, reducing the dependency on external funding. And the next slide is an example of the more upper income, middle income country, Maldives. They focus, next slide please. The focus is more on the livable environment, and we focus on solid waste management through waste to energy, attracting also the, engaging the state-of-the-art technologies. So here we provide the support to also private operators to come in, and the generated energy can cover the operational cost entirely, and also incentives for maintain. So this transforming this disgusting kind of environment, next to the slide, to more livable environment where people can come and enjoy. And the next slide, so it's a kind of a roadmap that we envisage that starting from external funding, more local resource mobilization, and eventually leading to private investment. Lastly, we talked a lot about financing, but let me emphasize on the importance of knowledge contribution. So we promote twinning of the cities and utilities to the best performing international best practices. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Yokoyama, for that high-speed sprint of your diverse range of experiences. And indeed, the differentiated approach that you shared with us is helpful in achieving a sort of unified vision of the South Asian context. We'd love to follow this up in the moderated discussion. And now we have with us a practitioner on the other end of the spectrum, one who has been at the forefront of representing people's perspectives and voicing disagreements in a constructive manner. We have with us Ms. Iromi Perera, an activist and an urban researcher from Sri Lanka. She works on land rights and spatial justice with a focus on development and dispossession in post-war Sri Lanka. She has led several initiatives and explores the city-making process in Colombo from a rights perspective, highlighting narratives that are often hidden or silenced. I invite Ms. Iromi to share with us her stories as she reads in between the lines of the agendas of new development in Sri Lanka. Iromi Perera.
Thanks, Naksha. Hi, everyone. And thank you, Seetha, for this invitation to speak today. I will be talking about our experience in Colombo's transition into a world-class city and what that means for people living here in terms of spatial justice and equity. So after the war ended in May 2009, Sri Lanka has been on a rapid development drive. Colombo has been at the center of much of this development, with successive governments' aspirations to transform Colombo into a world-class city. Pictured here is one of the most well-known and controversial projects, the Chinese-funded Port City Colombo. At an estimated cost of $15 billion, this is the largest development project of its kind in Sri Lanka, where the sea was dredged and claimed to build this new city, spanning over 600 acres, despite a lack of proper environment assessments. You'll also notice that the design is very similar to most global infrastructure plans of this nature, including in some of the slides that Professor Hasan showed us. Colombo's aesthetic is changing to resemble cities that planners consider as world-class. So Dubai, Shanghai, Singapore. It is accompanied by hoardings also that promise a better life of fancy houses and more jobs. There are several luxury apartment complexes such as this and other high-end mixed development projects being constructed all over the city today. We also have white elephant projects such as this telecommunications tower funded through Chinese loans, instead of investment in what we really need to make Colombo better, such as improved public transport, or making it a safer city for women and more green spaces. So the question is, who is this city really being developed for? And where is the space for what is old and informal? So these British period shop houses are the last of its kind in Colombo, and instead of preserving them, the plan is to demolish them to make way for a luxury apartment complex. So when you look at it that way, what does this development aesthetic and mindset mean for the working class and the urban poor communities in Colombo, who constitute over 50% of the city's population and live on only 10% of the land? So decades of investment by the state in housing and service provisioning, such as water, electricity, and roads, as well as people's own investment in their homes, has meant that Colombo does not have sprawling slums like in other South Asian cities. And around 90% of low-income settlements are permanently upgraded. What happens when informality doesn't fit in with Colombo's world-class aspirations? They do what many other cities have done unsuccessfully in the past. They, quote unquote, modernize them and densify them. These state-built high-rise complexes that you see in the photo here are going to be home to around 65,000 families. Already around 15,000 families have been involuntarily or forcibly moved. It is also supported by a constellation of development finance as well. For example, while the World Bank and ADB does not fund these high-rise projects directly, people who are affected by projects funded by these banks get relocated to these high-rises. So for affected people for whom Colombo is their village, where their families have lived for generations, this dispossession has had a devastating impact on their quality of life, with loss of income and livelihood and care and kinship networks. Women in particular bear the brunt of the shift to an unfamiliar built environment. So this is a high-rise complex where the individual apartment balconies had been removed so that the building would look uniform from the outside. So this means that women spend so many additional hours of the day just keeping an eye on their laundry. Design processes, as many of you know, are very gendered and class-driven. They don't always take into account the way that space is used in previous locations and the configuration of public and personal space. And time again, the communities that I work with said that they don't mind giving up their homes for development, but only if it is done fairly and they have a say in what happens. Because they too have dreams and aspirations based on all that this world-class city to come promises them. Sri Lanka has done housing for urban poor communities very well in the past, with a focus on in-situ upgrading, low-rise housing, and community-led participatory processes. The Million Housing Program in the 1980s is a great example of this. There are also very innovative tools and thinking that we can utilize in the present to understand the human cost of planning and design. For example, this is a photo of a game that was developed by a Bangalore organization called Fields of View that we played in Colombo with community members and planners and policymakers from state agencies. Building a city from scratch through a game taught everyone so many lessons about what different people prioritize when it comes to space and what experiences and aspirations drive those decisions. It also taught us what happens when we don't work together and then end up with a city that is unlivable. This is particularly important as in real life, we don't have the luxury of building from scratch and instead have to work with what we have in terms of limited land and resources as well as climate change. So the key takeaway from our work in Colombo that I wanted to share with you today is that if we want an equitable city, we need to have spatial justice at the heart of any planning or development process. Thank you.
Thank you, Iromi, for bringing to table some of those unheard voices. We would love to discuss this more further. Last but not the least, we have a seasoned practitioner who wears the most challenging hat of a bureaucrat. I'm honored to have with us Mr. Krishnan, an officer of the esteemed Indian Administrative Service. He's currently the Additional Chief Secretary of Finance Department for the Tamil Nadu State Government, India. He is also the Managing Director of the New Tirupur Area Development Corporation Limited. He has demonstrated expertise in policy making, public finance, and even socio-economic development. He has served as a senior advisor in the Office of Executive Director for India and several other countries in the IMF, representing the Government of India. I invite Mr. Krishnan to break the notions we have about the restrictive nature of regulations and share with us the potential of bureaucracy as he advocates for a systemic change. Mr. Krishnan, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Seetha and Naksha, for having me in this group. In a number of ways, I'm an outlier. I'm not a regular practitioner of urban design. I have done some of it through some of my jobs, which I have done in the past. So just a few thoughts that I would like to share. Chennai, the city where I live, not far from Colombo, not far from the Visakhapatnam corridor, Chennai corridor, which Mr. Yokoyama mentioned, is a colonial city and overlaid on a number of pre-existing habitations, and it has defined the way the city is developed, and part of what we want to do now is related to that. Very similar to what Iromi just mentioned, the World Bank did the Sites and Services project in Chennai as well, compared as they did in many other cities across the world, and fairly interesting experiences from that, which have come out recently and which are informing a modern policy or newer policy in the way the city grows. One, of course, is dense development, but low-rise development with some high-rises in areas where they are required, and the whole potential that when land is transferred as an asset to poor families, what exactly happens is important. Equally, Chennai as a city, like Dhaka, is stuck in the middle of rice paddies, stuck in the middle of various water bodies and various other areas which require low-lying land and where there could be substantial waterlogging. So that is one issue which often gets developed. Many of these locations that you see were formerly lake beds, tank beds, or rice paddies where the development takes place. So one of the episodes which we often talk about, the Chennai floods of 2015, is caused in areas like this. So how does new policy address the resilience question in addition to making space available is an important issue that we face now, and how resilience can be addressed is critical. I mean, how do you allow then for water to drain out of these areas? How do you look at this? Another important thing that we did was the combined development business rules about a couple of years ago, which are fundamentally designed around a notion of inclusive cities, making sure that the poor have space, because we did find that thanks to Western concepts, affordable housing is something which was simply not thought of. The minimum plot size that you needed in order to get a house approved was 80 square meters. And many of the poor in dense cities do not have that kind of land, which means that their access to institutional finance and their access to having a rule-based or a regular recognized housing was almost impossible. So some of that got corrected in the way that the rules got framed. The other element, of course, was how do you take care of the water supply requirements that need to be done for many of these cities. So all of these issues got addressed. We also ensured that we use space much more effectively. You densify construction, you permit up to about 18 meters of construction without too many hassles in terms of regulatory approvals. And that would something which would enable more housing to be built within limited areas. And you also recognize that a lot of affordable housing actually gets built by the private sector. And if there was a way in which it could become regular housing, a way in which it could access institutional finance, we would probably get far better results even for the poor. So this was an important element of the way the rules itself were drafted. And you can see how the footprints of buildings could be increased. And all of this enables the fact that housing could actually meet the needs of the poor in those areas. Equally, the other area, both with the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, we are now collaborating to look at the entire planning issue, participation. From bottom up, we build up the planning both for smaller cities. Small towns was something which was emphasized. Tamil Nadu fortunately has two big advantages. One, that inclusive housing has always been a focus. We've always, the rich and the poor have lived cheek by jowl. And as a conscious policy, we do not now permit gated communities. Equally, the other element is urbanization is widespread throughout the state. So how do you develop smaller communities is an important dimension that we look at. These are also some of the other elements to see how affordable housing can actually be promoted, so that the focus is really on the poor who occupy the cities, and how this has led to a fairly substantial increase in the number of housing permits that have been approved, which basically then implies that even the poor or affordable housing then increases substantially in terms of what is available in the cities. And there are a number of programs which the Tamil Nadu Slum Clearance Board and the Tamil Nadu Housing Board are doing. These are again parts of the affordable housing and habitat policy, which has been recently put out, which is again available on the internet. A lot of community stakeholders were all spoken to before a lot of this was finalized. So we've heard a lot of views before this was looked at. Thank you. This has been a wonderful learning experience listening to the other panelists as well. So let me stop here. I think my time has run out, and there are a number of possibilities which I would like to discuss in the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Krishnan, for the subtle provocations and your propositions. It has indeed provided a required impetus for a constructive discussion. I'd now like to invite all the speakers for a roundtable discussion as a culmination of all the mind-boggling ideas and thoughts and questions that were presented to us a few minutes ago. I request all the speakers to turn on their video cameras for the panel discussion. I would love to initiate the conversation, but feel free to crossbreed your own thoughts, express your views, and chime in as you feel free. And for the audience, feel free to quickly grab your chai as we begin the most exciting part, the design charrette. Global orientations and local perspectives. The challenge of orientation in this rapidly globalizing world of multicultural identities is something that we're all grappling with. It's not just an academic discourse or a practice challenge, but something that we all embody in different proportions. Why do we envision our cities to be like Manhattan or Dubai? Or will US solve the housing obsolescence crisis if it were to mimic incremental housing lessons from the South? I think the answer to these questions is not a simple deduction. The way ahead is not through juxtaposing global versus local, but to move beyond this conflict by reading it as an exchange. And I look forward to this discussion as a moment to unpack this tension of adoption and adaptation, especially in the realm of design practice and urban practice. One can observe that there is an increased knowledge production in the South Asian context, but there still seems to be a canon in terms of development. I'd like to invite Mr. Hasan and Professor Ashraf to reflect on how South Asian practices are trying to define or defy this canon in setting up their own design imperatives. Uh, Professor Hasan, please feel free to begin as Professor Ashraf will join us.
In my presentation, I tried to bring out the constraints. First of all, I think that we cannot, at least in the context of Pakistani cities, we cannot talk about the city itself, because now you have large urban regions rather than just cities. You have numerous satellite cities that have sprung up. Many villages have become dormitories. People sleep there, but they come to the city to work from very long distances. I think these are important aspects that have to be taken into consideration when entering the world of planning. I think this is not given sufficient attention, neither with academia and nor with practice. There are shared water sources. There are shared disposal points for sewage. And this development and its interdependence results in a lot of natural disasters, especially when you have large-scale rains, you have flooding, etc. So I think this is one aspect. The second aspect is what Iromi Perera, I think, has pointed out. It is extremely important that you are really not planning for your people. The big debate that we have been having in Karachi is houses versus apartments. Houses are cheaper, people want them, and with proper planning, you can get the same densities that the local bodies permit for high rises. You can get those same densities for small houses. And easy maintenance, people are happier. They don't have to pay common electricity bills, common water bills, a whole lot of paperwork that goes with living in an apartment and maintenance charges, etc. You are free with all those. Then, you know, there is other aspects which I would like to point out here. Formal sector bylaws are anti-street. They are anti-pedestrian. They are anti-mixed land use. They are anti-dissolved space. They are anti-everything that makes a low-income settlement livable. So there is a need to rethink this issue as well. Now, I have mentioned the problems that there are, the constraints there are in developing a more pro-people's planning. You know, the world of South Asia, as I know it over the last 50 years now, more than that, at every level, you have an organization. Shopkeepers organization, butchers organizations, goldsmiths organizations, transporters organizations. And they are constantly pushing their claims and guarding their gains. I mean, that's their job. I'm so sure Mr. Krishnan faces these aspects also. They don't figure in the planning process anywhere, although they very much shape the form of the city, including informal developers. And they are not there either in the courses of architecture and planning. They are absent. Similarly, you have organizations like the Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I'm just giving you one example. Railway Workers Union, they don't figure. They are not anywhere.
Yeah.
All they can do is protest, give statements to the media, and if they can have a rally and throw some stones, they are listened to. Otherwise, there is no hope for them. Now, this
Very
world
true.
has to change. If this world does not change, you are not going to have your people housed. You're not going to give them adequate and affordable transport. You're not going to be able to give them schools.
True.
There has to be a school mapping process, at least in my country. I
Yeah.
don't know if that's the same in other countries. MPAs and MNAs, members of parliament and provincial assemblies, decide where the school is going to be in their constituency, and they get the money for that as well. Now, this
Yeah.
whole world has to undergo a change. The problem is, how do you bring about this change?
Thank you,
We have
Professor
only been
Hasan.
able to.
Mr. Hasan, it's great how you outlined the finer nuances of like a broad range of topics. Before we would proceed to the next question, I would love to hear from Professor Ashraf what he feels, especially from the Bangladeshi context and also his experience across various countries.
Well, I think if I can catch your question again, I'll respond. No, I think the thinking is like, where is the action? You know, the cities that we had been speaking about and the cities that all of our panelists have been mentioning.
Naksha, I can't hear.
So I think there seems to be a lag. So
Sure.
you could
Okay.
proceed expressing.
Right. No, I was saying that, you know, the cities that we had been discussing or the cities that have been mentioned, there are all metropolitan complexes, and there are multiple ways of looking into the, you know, the whether you call it the crisis or the situations of the city. And I've kind of focused on one particular situation in the context of Dhaka, especially, like where is the action? And I think it's in the sort of the expanding nature of Dhaka city, and I find it very troubling. It's troubling in the sense that the city is embedded in a larger milieu. The city is not an island, and the expansion of the city is where the, if you like, the action is. You know, I've been thinking about that. The edge is now the new core, because that's where the biggest investment are being made. You know, in some of the examples that have been discussed, where large scale areas are taken over, whether by the state or by private initiatives. And mostly those areas are really sensitive ecologically and environmentally, whether they're wetlands or floodplains or agricultural lands, because land is cheap because of those reasons. And they're taken over. And they are very drastically changed or transformed by simple mechanisms of landfill. It's a very straightforward and disturbing and planning process, especially in the context of Dhaka. Landfill, and where, you know, the land is then plotted out, and then, you know, whether private property or private buildings are made. And this is what I would like to challenge and what I've been thinking about Dhaka. Because if you start changing those very sensitive areas, the devastation is going to return to you in many forms, not only climate change, but also like local environmental changes. And that's been my focus. And going back to that, the city is embedded in a larger milieu in the context of Bangladesh, in the context of the deltaic situation where Dhaka is. I think the planning has to start from the larger situation, you know, and I think I would like to return to what you might call regional planning, the flow of water. And I think, for any planning practice, the first premise is now you need to think about the flow of water. You need to work with the flow rather than like resisting that or creating like large infrastructural investment where you like, you know, force the water to flow in another direction, which will then really impact other regions. So I think what I had mentioned quickly in my quick presentation that followed the flow, that's something that I would like to kind of focus on, and I've been focusing on right now, and whether new urban formations can come out of that. And to end that, I think, you know, to put it simply, there are like sort of two pressures at loggerheads with each other. One is, well, of course, there are environmental laws which would like to retain these very sensitive, ecologically sensitive areas, but also at the same time, there are economic pressures to impact those areas. And I think we need to find a middle ground. And some of the examples that I showed you are examples of a middle ground.
Yeah, I think you've definitely raised that point of how could one deal or intervene beyond just mere appropriation. And I think definitely the presentations have raised a lot of questions, and we see the audience Q&A sort of overflowing. This question I'd like to address Mr. Kenichi Yokoyama. There was a mention of can we resort to local solutions to address the unique sensitivities of the context, but are local solutions all the time fiscally, environmentally, and socially sustainable? And what is the sort of challenge in scaling up local solutions?
Yeah, I think yeah, always it's good to have some local solutions and then develop, the sustainable, livable city from the existing setup. But I think we here probably we need to differentiate what is existing cities and what is the shape of the new cities. And the urban population will double in the next 25 years. So how are we going to accommodate this new population in which land modality? So that's something, of course, stakeholder consultation is needed. How to develop the new areas, reflecting some cultural, social implications.
Naksha, I can't hear.
With respect to the existing areas, how to develop is extremely challenging and difficult, but something we also need to work on. So I used to live in Kathmandu for 5 years, and I don't think changing the Kathmandu to Manhattan is not a solution. So you have to work out a good solution where traditional livelihood and social culture needs to be retained while accommodating the new entrants in a better way. So thank you.
Yeah, that's wonderful how you laid out and developed that differentiated approach I think you were talking about. And at this point, we have the two ends of the spectrum. Mr. Krishnan, who sort of represented the voice of the state, and Iromi, who brought to us to table some of the unheard voices. I'm very curious to ask the two of you, how would you sort of recenter the planning process itself to balance the two ends? And what is the role of professional expertise in mediating this particular disparity? Mr. Krishnan, you're muted.
I said, who would you like to go first?
You could always begin.
Okay.
The state prevails.
Oh no, I think it's in the essence of democracy and participation, how it gets mediated. And Mr. Arif Hasan was pointing out how you have various kinds of organizations. What is amazing with hearing of experiences from Dhaka, from Karachi, from Colombo, is the extent of similarity which is there, and I mean how issues are common, similar, and the way in which we can learn from each other. Clearly, participation happens in a number of ways, and ultimately democracy is also of intermediating between interest groups, and we are constantly working with interest groups. There is some degree of transparency, there is some degree of consultation, some of it is out in the open. There are meetings, sometimes they end up being very noisy, the consultative meetings, you don't hear voices. At other times you gain inputs through smaller discussions, through talking to a cross section of people. I think the most important thing which you need to ultimately, the middle ground you need to build, is trust. And it really helps when governments actually draft regulations and put it out in the public domain receive comments, respond to them, and then see where it works. That's something that we tried in the case of the building regulations. Then, of course, there are judicial organizations, the courts which intervene, and that gives you another opportunity to get back. So sometimes policy making is like sausage making. It takes a while, it takes time, and there is a long process. And we shouldn't get impatient with it. We have to realize that it will take time, but it might take a little longer to find the kind of solution that you're looking for. But rather than push something arbitrarily and rapidly, maybe it helps to persist with it and hear a few more voices before you finally decide. But then everyone in the end gives up something. I mean, everyone gives up on the idealized vision of what they want and exactly what they want. It's just that they need to have trust that while they're giving up something, they're also gaining something. So if you're able to mediate that process of give and take, then it certainly helps. And we learn in the process all the time. And if you see, that's how policy making changes, the process changes, and that's how policies also change. We learn and we change. And so a sense of history there is important to understand where this came from and to understand in which direction it's heading. Thank you.
Ms. Perera, would you like to add?
Yeah, thanks, Naksha. I definitely agree with everything that Mr. Krishnan said, and particularly around participation, but also that all this takes a lot of time. And I think that is for us sometimes where the frustration lies, which is that a lot of these plans, infrastructure projects, housing projects that are planned, they take, I mean, realistically 30, 40 years to, kind of see it from end to end. But we are dealing in a system where governments change every 5 years, and then they have to show some kind of result at the end of it in order to get re-elected again. So you have bureaucrats working in this kind of a very messy system, and then people who are affected caught in the middle of it. So with the kind of work that we do, we kind of see ourselves as the middleman, where we're trying to bring community members, affected people, and the state and planners to the same table, because most often that's really not what happens, where plans are made and then how it's conveyed to a community is usually through like either like a PowerPoint presentation or a leaflet. So feedback is not always a very participatory process. People assume, particularly planners assume, that affected communities, mainly if they're working class poor, they don't know what they want, they don't know what they're talking about, so it's up to them to tell them. So I think there needs to be sort of a mindset change also, that everyone has an equal vote at the table, everyone has an equal voice, because at the end of the day, you are designing a policy or a program that affects somebody that doesn't really directly affect you. Like, for example, in the high rises that I showed, the planners and the designers themselves are not the people living in these high rises. Most of them have never even lived in an apartment complex before. They have lived in a house all their life. So you are designing for people whose way of life and circumstances and preferences are not known to you. So I think, like what Mr. Krishnan said, what is important is transparency, feedback, continuous conversations, and a multidisciplinary approach, that because we are dealing with humans and lives, we have to have people of various disciplines at the table, different voices, and the patience to listen to everyone and to do the whole give and take. Thanks, Naksha.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your opinions. And definitely, this has really triggered a lot of response from the audience. We see the dialogue box sort of overflowing, but due to the paucity of time, I know we are all enjoying this, but I'd like to wrap up this session actually with one round of final question for all the panelists. And as Professor Rahul Mehrotra raised in the start, and also as we see many of the audience asking questions about the most debatable topic in the South Asian context, that of density. So we see in the presentations today, like density can almost be a double-edged sword. While we leverage the potential of high density, it also comes with its challenges of the burden of supply of infrastructure. I invite all the speakers to express their thoughts in just one quick line or a very quick response on how to approach and conceptualize this animal of density as we chart our vision ahead for South Asian development. Mr. Kenichi Yokoyama, would you like to begin? Your thoughts on
Yeah,
density?
thank you. Yeah, anyway, as I said, density management needs to be, considered based on the that are concerned stakeholders in mind. I think for the new areas, newly developed townships, definitely, which would attract the, new immigrants or industrial workers, needs to have desirably, have a density, the vertical development of urban areas. Whereas the city centers where tradition, culture is embedded, we really need to think of, low-rise, preservation of existing culture, beautification of riverfront and waterfront, and cultural heritage. It should be the so it depends on the circumstances that the particular area is concerned, I would say. And of course, the poor people may wish to live in low-rise. That should be a part part of the consultative process, and it's extremely important to design the future urban areas with sufficient stakeholder consultation. Thank you.
Feel free to follow in, Professor Ashraf.
Okay. I think the question of density should be immediately seen in relation to footprints, and I think they go hand in hand, because in the I think going back to how cities are expanding organisms, it really raises the question, where do we end? That's one thing. In 2012, we looked at Dhaka in terms of a nexus, not just the metropolitan core, but a radius of 2-hour travel distance, within which, I quickly showed 24 towns, small towns that we looked at. I think it begs the question of how the density of Dhaka could be revitalized or remanaged or reorganized by actually reorganizing the density of the other towns. And again, now just, again, the question of density also brings up what kind of other new facilities, urban realm that you want to create for the small towns. And I think they go hand in hand, the metropolitan core as well as the satellite situations of the towns in that constellation that we looked at. So I think density, and then as well as the urban realm that you're going to create for the constellation of towns, and the footprint of each of the towns. And then with the footprint, it begs the question of the edge. The edge is very important, because edge is where the battle is being now raised.
Please feel free to continue, Mr. Krishnan, Iromi. Iromi, feel free to chime in.
Sure. Just to add that, I think, yes, with land scarcity and population growth, densification seems to be the likely choice. But I think what really needs to make this more viable is a more sort of a data and research driven process. Also, for example, say in our case, do we really need this amount of high-end luxury apartment, high-rises? Is the need really for more middle-income housing or low-income housing? And communities also incrementally build, and in our cases, it's also addressing a cultural issue of or a cultural idea of what makes a home, about leaving a home behind for a generation, being able to add floors or annexes and so on. But the other thing that I just want to end with is just around public transport also. A big reason why people don't want to, they don't want to move to the high rise, but they also don't want to leave the city center because that's where work and school is. And leaving to the outskirts or leaving the city invariably means for people a longer distance to work and to school and higher costs. And these are some things that great public transport can address, affordable public transport, accessible public transport, where then people are maybe in time to come, maybe more open to leaving the city center and being able to have this kind of a house and a garden kind of concept, but not be placed too far from work and home. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think a lot of the issues then really center about either transit-oriented developments where they can take place, and also increasing public spaces and common spaces which are accessible. Even if you have denser neighborhoods, at least poorer families have access to public spaces. One other issue which many cities really have to address is that public spaces don't then get fenced in or get available only on payment basis to the better off. So I think these are critical issues, and that really governs the vision for a city, because sometimes we view it as large shiny projects, but in a number of cases it just might be small neighborhood parks. I mean, Chennai, for instance, has seen an explosion of small neighborhood parks over the last 15-20 years, which I think has really improved the quality of living of people. I lived outside Chennai for almost 14 years. When I returned, I was struck by the number of small parks which are developed in neighborhoods, which a lot of people use to walk, to do for recreation and so on. So these are the kind of ways in which, with denser footprints, more tightly knit communities, you also provide spaces for them to get out.
Wonderful. And it's unfortunate that we've lost Mr. Hasan due to some technical glitches. And with that, I think we got a diverse range of impressions, from rethinking of footprints to space, to improving data research, and also reimagining high-rise developments. I think it was a wonderful range of impressions on density. And with this, I would like to request the panelists to continue sharing, expressing their opinions, and answering some of the questions that have actually been raised in the Q&A session. However, I'm sure this discussion has left a lot of thoughts lingering in our mind and given us a lot to chew on. I'd like to invite Seetha Raghupathy to take over the stage for the concluding note. Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure talking to you all. Seetha?
Thank you, Naksha, for moderating that so beautifully. As we come to the close of the session, a big thanks to all of our panelists who've brought rich perspectives across multiple South Asian countries, which sort of at once showed us how unique every city is, while also emphasizing the broader cross-cutting challenges that we face. In closing, I would like to highlight three emergent themes that arose in the discussion. First is the notion of equity. Most South Asian countries and cities are under pressure to promote economic competitiveness, while at the same time needing to deal with the fallout from globalization, such as poverty. And a new urban order seems to play to market forces and land speculation, which has dire consequences on a vast majority of the population. Our role as design thinkers and practitioners is to ensure we embed equity in everything we do, so everyone can benefit from the urban advantage and prosperity in cities. Second, and I combine two themes here, one is designing with less, and the second, designing for all. Designing with less. As Mr. Yokoyama pointed out, many cities have severe capacity constraints. So as planners and design thinkers, we need to make sure we have a differentiated approach across low income and middle income countries to ensure sustainable development outcomes. Designing for all, it is very important that we embrace informality and make sure that we do not hinder the urban poor through regulation or displace them through mega projects. Mr. Hasan reminded us of this through the Pakistani case examples. Third, city building is a collaborative and cumulative process. Both Mr. Ashraf and Ms. Perera brought in rich experiences from Bangladesh and Sri Lanka in this regard, while Mr. Krishnan's presentation reminded us that bureaucracy need not only be about imposition and control, instead can pave way for implementable solutions that place inclusion as the core focus. In closing, I would like to highlight a quote from sociologists Osborne and Rose, who say that city making and the rights to a city is as much about duties as it is about entitlements. Our role as agents of change is to embed this thinking in the populations we serve so that everyone across the socio-economic spectrum can benefit from design's agency while also contributing to a better world one step at a time. Thank you. With this, we close the first panel, and it is my privilege to introduce to you the second session curator and moderator, Nupur Gurjar. Nupur is a current student at the GSD. She's an architect, designer, and strategic thinker who is very passionate about design for humanitarian response. She has worked in India and the US and is currently working on her thesis where she is developing an experiential tool for potential climate migrants in Bangladesh. Thank you everyone for attending the first session, and over to Nupur for the second session.
Thank you for the introduction, Seetha. What must people of this planet think? The ground knobby and dry, the oceans blue powder, the mountains, which they agree are beautiful, and the turquoise, never has there been such a color, breaking into precious stones. They build houses, from them, grand places of worship. And there is so much to worship. Look up, for instance, 6 suns, the wonder of it. First one, then the next, eclipsing. The plausibility that their world hangs by a thread, a tsunami in the sky. There has to be someone can do, like raise the awareness to those around you, that if we don't heed the problem at hand, it's your life that's at stake, the destruction of man. Credits to Art Project Earth for this heartful rendition. A warm welcome to everybody listening to the session 2 of Design Impact, Volume 3 on climate migration in South Asia. Although South Asia only occupies approximately 3% of the world's land area, the region is home to over 24% of the world's population, nearly 1.9 billion. The region has some of the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change, and one of the least equipped to handle what's to come. Climate events, like natural disasters, displace people for relatively short periods of time, but millions of victims to erosion or sea level rise are uprooted by gradual environmental changes and receive comparatively little support to cope and adapt. Why are we failing to act? We clench our heart at headlines that were too late to appear and despair at the thought of the number of lives that could have been saved. The Himalayan meltdown in Afghanistan, Bhutan, and Nepal, the peril due to sea level rise in Pakistan, the Ganges-Brahmaputra Meghna Delta affecting India and Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and in the Maldives, the flattest country on earth, with a lingering possibility that a majority of its land will be underwater by the end of this century. Is it too late to reverse the impending damage from climate change? Migration is often resorted to as the last option in case other means of survival are also lost. Unfortunately, every success story, there are cautionary tales of exploitation. For migration means a scattered nation. Will we ever be able to restore all the pieces in time to save the planet and ourselves? Sit back to witness perspectives related to climate impacts of environmental upheavals on migration dynamics in South Asia. Learn about approaching this multidimensional phenomenon, which presents an opportunity to function as a unified force with strategic and integrated mindset. Without further ado, I would like to invite our keynote speaker for the session, Ms. Licypriya Kangujam. Ms. Licypriya is a 9-year-old climate activist and founder of the child movement championing the cause to protect, preserve, and nurture our environment by fighting climate change. She is a 2019 World Children Peace Prize laureate and Global Child Prodigy Award winner in 2020. She is currently in grade 3 at school in Delhi, India, and has addressed world leaders in the United Nations Climate Conference 2019. Ms. Licypriya, over to you now to enthrall us all with your keynote address.
Yes, thank you so much, Harvard Graduate School Design Alumni Council, for inviting me to speak in this program. I was born in Manipur, which is the small, beautiful northeastern state of India, but I've grown up in Bhubaneswar, Odisha. My birthplace is surrounded by lush green mountains and alluring atmosphere. I came to Delhi in 2016 for the first time. But my life became very messy due to the high air pollution, and it turns me into a child climate activist. Later, I moved to Bhubaneswar, Odisha for my schooling, and again my home in Odisha was hit by Cyclone Titli in 2018 and Cyclone Fani in 2019. All such incidents in my young life turns me into a child climate activist. India is facing lots of environmental issues like flood, drought, heat wave, cyclone, earthquake, locust, air pollution, typhoon, cyclone, etc. at the same time. These are all the impact of climate change. You can just see about the Delhi air pollution. It is very dangerous, and over 600,000 children died every year. And our leaders are just busy in blaming each other instead of finding a long-term solution. They are just telling their speech, they're not doing any action. I want our world leaders to take immediate climate action to save our planet and our future. And also, you see, why should I talk about the climate change? Why should I talk about the global warming? Why should I talk to the people about the various environmental issues happening around the world? I have to read my books, I have to play with my friends, I have to study, I have to enjoy my beautiful childhood life. But our leaders ruined all our beautiful childhood life. Climate change is not only for me or for someone else or for you. Climate change problem is for every single person living in this world. Each and every child living in this country, living in this world, are already the victims of climate change. That's why I'm fighting to save our planet and our future. And also, today I have a small message to all the children and the people of the world. Children must tell the parents that they should walk if it's nearby or they can use the bicycle. Please don't use car or bikes every time. And also, children must tell the parents that they shouldn't use single-use plastic at their home and don't throw garbage or plastic on street, ocean, rivers, seas, or any other places. And also, I want our government to shut down all the coal power plants and thermal power plants and replace it by clean energy. And also, I want to see more electric and solar vehicles and instead of more petrol and diesel vehicles. And also, these are the small things we can do at our home to fight the climate change. These little things can make a huge difference. Thank you.
Thank you for starting us off with your motivational speech, Ms. Licypriya. Your voice and continued activism has and will continue to reach far and wide. Thank you so much for being with us here today. I'm excited. Sure. I am excited to start off our panel presentations. Each of our 5 panelists will give us quick presentations offering regional, national, and native outlook on climate-induced migration. I would like to call upon our first panelist for the day, Mr. Abhas Jha. Mr. Jha is Practice Manager, Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management for South Asia region at the World Bank, who works on cities, technology, climate risk and resilience, public policy, and has earlier served as advisor to the World Bank Executive Director for Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Sri Lanka. He has authored books and contributed chapters to several publications and cited by leading ones like the Financial Times and the New York Times, amongst others. Over to you, sir.
So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Nupur, for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. I'll be very quick. Actually, I wanted to go back to the last session and Seetha's closing remarks, and she made a very interesting remark about designing for all and designing with less. I actually wanted to add one more point to that, and that comes from Mr. Ramsevak Sharma, who's the architect of the Aadhaar program, which is the biometric identity program in India. And he says designing for a billion. And I think in all these solutions and that we talk about, we need to think about scale. There are a lot of solutions that are offered that are frankly not scalable. So when we do think about solutions, let's think about designing for a billion. When we talk about the climate change in the context of COVID, the question that often arises is that, is there cause for hope or is there cause for despair? And my sense is that there's more cause for hope than despair. And let me give you 3 examples of that. So the first is the technological and scientific innovation. We have a vaccine in less than a year. whereas the fastest was for mumps, which took about 5 years. So there's been a lot of innovation in that space. So that gives us hope. The second is the fact that we have adapted by and large as a society to the changes that were demanded, the things like wearing masks, social distancing. So that means the society can adapt to big shocks. So that's the second cause for change. And the third is on the politics of it. So at least in the rich countries, they have found the enormous amount of resources to be able to respond effectively to the challenges posed by the pandemic. So that means that when we are faced with an existential crisis, the political system can respond. So these all give me hope. So the first point I want to make is that climate migration is happening right now. It's not something that's going to happen in the future. There was a UN report that came out last year, which estimated that in South Asia by 2050, if it's business as usual, we'll have about 63 million climate migrants. That's the equivalent of the population of Italy. Just last year alone, 2020, we had 18 million climate migrants in South Asia. So this is something that's happening. And this photo, if you're wondering, is from Cyclone Amphan when it hit the Sundarbans region in India and Bangladesh. So we are seeing the devastating consequences of climate change. So a little bit about myself and the World Bank. So Nupur did mention my work at the World Bank. So I work in the South Asia region. South Asia region means India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nepal, Maldives, Sri Lanka. So 8 countries in all. And so as you can imagine, a very varied and very different set of contexts in each country. The World Bank is the largest financer for climate change action in the world. And we have a climate change action plan, which are right now in the midst of updating. So, this comes from the IPCC 2018 report, which has been described as the most important sentence of the last few centuries, which says that if we want to get to net zero, we need to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030 and net zero by 2050, if we want to remain within the 1.5 degree warming. So that kind of gives you the window of the action that's needed. Next slide, please. This is a traditional step well from India, which is called a baoli. And the reason I'm showing you this is that we need top-down and bottom-up approaches to climate change, which will include traditional water storage methods like the baoli or these jalis, which were the traditional ways of insulating buildings. And this will combine with the high-tech innovations like hydrogen fuel cells or sponge cities in China or wind turbines or solar, all of which are exciting things that are happening in South Asia as we speak. A cost of 1 unit of electricity through solar in India is now about 1 rupee 99 cents, which is cheaper than any form of electricity. And we'll have to link this to jobs. So this is a photo of Durga Bhatt in Nepal. She's one of the first female masons who's reconstructing houses after the earthquake in Nepal. So we'll have to think of how do we generate jobs, millions of jobs, well-paying jobs through the new economy. And this will mean these 5 alignments. We'll need to align top-down and bottom-up. We'll need to align the market incentives. By one estimate, there's $500 billion of money, private money waiting to enter the solar market in India. So how do we make these private money come in? Align public expenditure with ambitious action. So governments spend billions of dollars. If we can put a climate lens on them, that would be a tremendous step forward. We need to think about jobs. And then finally, we need to think about institutions. It cannot be just the Ministry of Climate Change that's thinking of climate change. It needs every single agency, every single entity thinking about what is to be done. So I'll stop here and thank you very much.
That was remarkable, Mr. Abhas. Thank you for setting the stage with a global and regional perspective on climate change and for giving us hope. I would now love to introduce our next panelist for today. On this panel, Ms. Runa Khan, who is the founder and executive director of Friendship NGO, Bangladesh, an Ashoka Fellow, Schwab Entrepreneur, and a Rolex Award laureate. Runa Khan works with the most hard-to-reach and unaddressed communities in Bangladesh, serving 6.5 million lives a year through her organization. Climate adaptation, poverty alleviation, and empowerment. The organization creates sustainable solutions and brings dignity and hope to each life it touches. Ma'am, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be with all of you. And you know, climate migration and also finding solution has been my work for the last 20 years. And it's not a work which I have been doing sitting in the cities or sitting abroad, but really integrated with the communities, seeing the land break in front of our eyes, seeing people migrate, seeing children flow away, you know, with the rivers. You know, this has been something which I have lived through for 20 years, and I needed to find solution. We all know that Bangladesh ranks seventh, you know, in the CRI, but seventh doesn't show the reality because of the demography of Bangladesh. It's one of the most populated countries in the world, 170 million people, 148 approximately square kilometers of land, 30% underwater all the time, and 100% of the country, some way or the other, getting impacted by the climate effect. And we see this in front of us daily, simply because the country is so small, the country is built up of silt, and everything that affects has an incredible synergetic effect inland. It's only 80% of the country is 5 meters above the sea level. So be it cyclones, be it floods, we get the impact and we need to find solutions. I'll show you a short video on friendship to bring you into context. We have been working over 20 years as you know, as has been said, in poverty alleviation, mainly saving lives, climate action, and empowerment, because at the end of the day, the only way you can leave a community behind with capacity is to ensure that they can stand up themselves with empowerment, dignity, and hope. So I would like you to please open the video. A little work on friendship. Everything that we have done, everything that we need to do has to integrate migration. Over 90% of people in the core projects of friendship are all climate migrants. We serve over 7 million people every year dealing with climate refugees, IDPs, you know, who move from IDPs who are moving from areas to areas because of the climate impact. And today, all the solutions that we find, we have seen one thing. It is not technology, it's not innovation. What we really need to do is to find solution, locally adapted solution. Our plinths you have seen, cyclone shelters you have seen, and also all our schools, and our healthcare, which is all mobile, dealing with the communities. Because one thing for sure, the poor cannot afford poor solutions to really have impact and to continue their lives. Thank you.
Your work inspires us all, Ms. Runa, and I hope friendship continues to touch lives, empower and strengthen community resiliency more and more in the future. Next up, we have Mr. Sudipta Kumar Badapanda, Country Director, ActionAid, based in Kabul, Afghanistan. Mr. Sudipta has over 20 years of experience in the development sector with significant work in conflict and post-conflict contexts of Asia and Africa with some of the most marginalized people to design projects and programs on food security, resilience, and disaster risk reduction. He currently leads ActionAid's program in Afghanistan with a key focus on empowerment of women and girls and food and nutrition security through resilient and climate-smart agriculture and humanitarian practices. We welcome you, Mr. Sudipta Kumar.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about migration in Afghanistan and also what we are doing to prevent or mitigate these things. I think if you can go to the first slide here, as you can see, Afghanistan is a landlocked country. It is bordered by maybe 5 or 6 countries. And this has also meant that it has its own peculiar set of issues. One is that even though 60% of the people are dependent on agriculture, the GDP it produces is only about 23%. And the other fact is that it is import dependent, and also because of the conflicts in this country as well as the climate related events, there has been large number of migrants inside the country, but they also usually migrate to 2 neighboring countries, Iran and Pakistan. So this is basically the context in Afghanistan. If you can go to the next slide, Nupur. Yeah, this is the climatic condition in Afghanistan is between arid to semi-arid zone, in this arid and semi-arid zone. It is primarily, as we spoke about, primarily an agrarian economy. So basically, when one talks about arid and semi-arid zone, I think the whole large tract of north and west, which is more or less like desert condition, but also it has high snow precipitation during winter between October and December. And then, followed by a big flood. And, as we will see in the next slide. But then, in this country, this is how it looks like. You can see, these are all pictures from our project areas, where we work. But maybe we can go back to the previous slide just so that, I am able to cover all of it. And as we see, I think the conflict and climate are 2 major drivers, and internal as well as external displacement in Afghanistan. The internal displacement monitoring unit, it spoke about the internal monitoring center rather. It spoke about it calculated that there's a typo here. By end of 2019, there were about 1.2 million climate migrants. It was basically because of disasters, natural disaster, primarily flood and drought, of which more than 33% of them were actually only in one single year, 2018, which was a major drought year in Afghanistan. And these 1.2 million people, who are internally displaced inside the country, basically form about 40% of total IDPs in the country, which is at 2.9 million. And the World Bank estimates that due to the flood, by 2050, the number of people being affected will double by 2050. So that also means that there will be large-scale migration within the country. It may also lead to migration outside the country in search of livelihood. Because being a landlocked country, it has many areas which are porous that allows, quote unquote, allows people to go to neighboring countries in search of work. And of course, because being undocumented, they also face a lot of issues. It is because 62% about people are dependent on agriculture, and with the UNEP suggests that, I think estimates that the increase in temperature is expected to impact production of agriculture, which will reduce. That means, it will also impact a large number of people who are dependent on agriculture. This is the reason that, ActionAid thinks that, and not only ActionAid thinks, and all of us think that it needs both programmatic as well as policy intervention, so that we can ensure that, so programmatically, we have been, working with the communities. This is the one. Basically to promote resilient agriculture, so that, livelihoods of people, when they are not affected, obviously, or lives and livelihoods of the people when they are not affected, the chances of internal displacement reduces. That is how our understanding is. So that is the reason that in some of the most sensitive areas of Afghanistan, particularly climate sensitive zones like in Bamia, I think the whole of Afghanistan is climate sensitive, but we're working in highlands, in the north, in the west, everywhere we're working to promote resilient agriculture. So we try to work with smallholder farmers to promote sustainable agriculture through various means, including watershed development. Okay, I have finished, yeah. So maybe we can go to the last slide, and then I can, or maybe we can just move the slides just to show you the range of work that we're doing. And this is how we try to look at mitigating the livelihood issues of the people to ensure that they are able to take care of their livelihood, so that it also reduces migration. Yeah, probably, I think we can speak more about it during our question and answer. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Sudipta. The landscape of Afghanistan is a wonder of nature too marvelous to be lost. I'm sure we'll pick up on some of your adaptation strategies in our moderated session. I would now love to call upon Ms. Pasang Dolma Sherpa, Executive Director, Center for Indigenous Peoples Research and Development based in Kathmandu, Nepal. Ms. Pasang has been working with indigenous peoples, women, and local communities for the promotion and recognition of the traditional knowledge, cultural values, and customary institutions that contributed for natural resource management, climate change resilience, and sustainable development for more than a decade, both at national and international levels. Currently, she represents Asia Indigenous Peoples to the FWG Chair of Specialist Group on Indigenous Peoples, Customary and Environmental Laws and Human Rights, and is visiting faculty at Kathmandu University in Nepal. Ms. Pasang, the stage is yours to share with us your rich knowledge and experience.
Thank you, Nupur. Tasidile, namaskar, good morning, good evening for everyone. My great pleasure to be part of the panel. Thank you, Nupur and Alpa and all the team for this opportunity. My pleasure to share the impacts of climate change and the struggle of indigenous peoples in Nepal. As you know, Nepal is a mountainous country, and the highest mountain on earth, the mountain Everest, lies in Nepal. There are more than 18 different indigenous groups, peoples living in mountain, and along with the impacts of climate change on the mountains, they have already experiencing the changing of their livelihoods patterns due to the impacts of climate change. Nepal is hit by the impacts of climate change. Nepal as a fourth vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change, the rise of temperatures and the impacts on the livelihoods everywhere. However, the rises of the temperature in the mountains is higher, consequently with the hard impacts on the livelihoods of the indigenous people living in the mountains. The mountain indigenous peoples who have been facing the tremendous impacts of the climate change, now already experiencing the impacts on their livelihoods, traditional livelihoods, the livestock patterns, the grazing patterns, even the low production of the stable foods, especially potatoes, and also increasing the wildfire in the mountains, even in the winter. As you see in this picture, that the red spots, the potential glaciers lakes in Nepal, which are almost 47 potential dangerous lakes are already identified with the potential high impacts on the livelihoods, economy, biodiversity, and as well as natural resources, and the impacts on their traditional livelihoods of the indigenous peoples in the mountain regions. One of the examples here, the impacts of the climate change, along with the flash floods emerging from the glaciers outbursting lakes, that the impacts of the flash frost already experienced by the Sherpas, especially in the living in the mountains in Rolwaling district in Nepal. The state of the Chorolpa lakes is increasing, ever increasing, as you see in the pictures. And then the impacts of the flash frost has already experienced by the Sherpas there, not only physical impacts, but also psychological impacts. The psychological impacts of the state of bursting the glacier lakes is more dangerous than the real experience of being swept away. So this has really tremendous impacts of many indigenous peoples, especially Sherpas living close down to the Chorolpa lake, already migrating to down and also in the cities. And also the converting, because of the converting of the fertile lands into almost completing into rovels of the sand. Another examples also from Zomsong, another mountainous region of Nepal, where the whole community, because of the drying water resources in their area, have already migrating and becoming the climate refugee. This is just another pictures I would like to share. The changes of the snowfall patterns has how the last year pictures, the same time taken this year, no snow and already impacts on the livelihoods, especially the Gokyo lakes, which used to be frozen all the time there. Now is the frozen lakes is turning into the ponds. The impacts of the climate change is not only on the livelihoods, but also the our spiritual and our traditional practices and also cultural. As you see the example, the picture here on the left, that the indigenous people in Jomsong traditionally made of the Mars with the open roof is now changing into a tin roof because of decreasing the snowfall and increasing the unexpected rainfalls. And whereas in other part, the prayer wheels no more roaming because of the drying water resources and also the drinking water resources scarcity felt by the people on the ground. This is one of the important things that we all need to understand, that the 6.2 population of indigenous people around the world, majority of them, more than 70% living in the rural area, experiencing their traditional livelihoods still now. One of the biggest contribution that we all need to understand, that the recent study that come up across, that 10% of indigenous people legally recognized territories have been contributing for more than 80% of the biodiversity. The basis of contribution of this biodiversity is because of the continuation of their traditional knowledge, their cultural practices, their the revival of their customary institution and the value system. Despite the fact that to come up with a different report, including IPCC, even the recent report of the IPCC 2018 also talks about, and as well as the different research around the world, coming up with the fact that the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples are the pertinent role for contribution of climate change adaptation and mitigation, and even the ecosystem biodiversity. Indigenous people with the low carbon footprints have already impacts of the climate change, and this impacts has been severely affected, more doubled due to the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the most challenges of the indigenous peoples we have been facing is because our values, our role, our contribution, there's no recognition, neither recognized by our policies, programs, provisions at the national level and implication at the ground level, as because one of the most serious part is because we have been seeking the impacts of climate change solution outside our values, when where we have a wealth of knowledge inside. The concept of eating and aiming is prevalent here because we are always thinking that the Western values, the modern values, the capitalist values is the solution, which is in fact not shown already in our reality that we have been already experiencing. And the impacts, the climate change impacts is already been seen, and the indigenous people are hardly considered as in the policy discourse to the deal with the climate change impacts. And then this impacts already been, the discourse at the global level already started along with the establishment of the local communities and indigenous people platform with the promotion of indigenous knowledge. However, it's the implication on the ground level at the national level depends on how realistic, depends on how serious we become and how we join hands together and for the recognition of the indigenous people, customary practices, institution, governance system to deal with the impacts of climate change on the ground levels. With this one, thank you very much. And I would be happy to respond if there is any queries. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pasam. truly eye-opening to learn about climate change threatening human settlements and indigenous populations, and calls for increased attention to this region. Thank you for being with us. Our next panelist is Mr. Kashif Majid Salik, Associate Research Fellow at Sustainable Development Policy Institute, Islamabad, Pakistan. Before joining the institute, Mr. Salik worked with Global Change Impact Studies Center on conducting research, developing plans and strategies for enhancing rural households' resilience to climate change in Pakistan. He also worked with the International Water Management Institute as an agricultural economist and is pursuing a PhD at University of Southampton, UK. Over to you, Mr. Salik.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nupur, for the kind introduction. Good afternoon or good morning. I will briefly present our research work on climate change-induced migration in Pakistan. Migration in Pakistan is primarily rural to urban. Therefore, our focus is rural areas. So before presenting my research findings, I will provide the context. So Pakistan is largely an agrarian society, and about 120 million population of Pakistan is living in rural areas. So the socio-economic indicators are very much alarming in rural areas. For example, you see that 60% of the working population of Pakistan live in rural areas, and half of them are unemployed. Similarly, you can see that the rural poverty accounts 36%. So if we include the 21% transitory poor, it's become 65%. So this impact is huge in the society. Another striking feature, which is very relevant to our climate-induced migration studies, is the demography, in which the 75% of rural population, which constitute 90 million people out of 120 million rural population, are landless and small farmers and agricultural laborers. So these people are mostly poor. In the above right, the map shows the green area shows the Indus Plain area, where most of the agriculture happening and most of the population is living in Pakistan. And you can see that most of the rural poor are living in those areas, as you can see in the map below. Next, please. So beside this high population growth, high poverty rates, and single sector dependency, the rural areas are highly vulnerable to climate change impacts. On average, about 5 climate events per year are occurring in Pakistan, and they cause to decline in agriculture production, rise in food security and unemployment, and inequality in terms of access to finances, access to services or jobs. So there was a huge climate change is impacting in different dimensions and angles. So in this context, when we started working on climate-induced migration, we need to identify the hotspots area of climate-induced migrations. For this, we find a research study done by Muller and her colleagues in 2014 on human migration and weather climates. So using 21 years of longitudinal data and in different 5 different districts, 4 districts in Pakistan, they concluded that the heat stress during the winter, which is the wheat growing season in Pakistan, is mostly strongly associated with the migrations. So we make this study as a base of our research, and then we develop our future migration hotspots area. So first we look into that how the future heat stress or heat waves can impact in Pakistan. So we develop climate heat wave scenarios by using the RCP 8.5 business as usual scenario, and you can see that there is an increasing trend of heat waves in Pakistan, particularly the areas where most of the agriculture is happening and most of the people are living. So once we identify the heat wave areas where they are impacting the people, and mostly the heat waves, and based on the study that heat waves are causing people to migrate. So we identify the wheat districts which are mostly producing the wheat, and then we identify the most poor people that are living in those districts. And then we combine that map in the third map, and through this we identify the hotspots area for climate-induced migrations, and we identify five districts, vulnerable districts, to study the climate change impact. Next slide, please. So using the mixed method approach, both the quantitative and qualitative methods and in-depth interviews and field study, we in 5 districts in 2 different studies, we find many findings, but I like to share with you the most important thing, which is much more related with the climate migrant agency. So first of all is that the fast onset climate change are less likely to cause migrate, particularly the land holding classes. But the landless and non-farm rural household are migrating because of this fast onset climate changes, just like floods, droughts, and heat waves. So, and in the second, what we found that the slow onset climate changes are more likely to trigger migration as a contextual relationship, particularly common among the land holding classes, but also landless and rural, non-farm rural households are also migrating because of the slow onset. So, the climate change has a causal relationship with the landless migrants, landless rural population to migrate, while for the landholding classes, it acts as a contextual relationship. So why people are migrating? Because of there is a loss of farm productivity, income, and job opportunities. There is a lack of preparedness to floods and droughts, and people are not able to manage the mega floods and the impacts of that floods. And they have because of the people are not ready, and because of the ineffective early warning systems, and there is loss of lives and okay. So this shows the climate-induced migration patterns. The red line shows the climate-induced migration patterns, and the green line shows the typical migration pattern where they act as a contextual relationships. So whenever the climate extreme hits the origin areas, the rural areas, the people mostly migrate to the designated displacement areas, relief camps, and then they migrated. The corrections show D shows that they move to the destination areas. So some people have the social network, so they directly move to the destination areas. But whenever the destination is hit by the climate extremes, they maybe we can see the climate migrant returns to the origin areas, or they remigrate to second destination urban areas or mega cities, or they migrate internationally. So in this context, migration outcomes for the sending areas, migration is an opportunity in a sense, because most of the rural poor or resourceless people are actually migrating, and they are fleeing from the food insecurity and lack of education and health that provide. But when they move to the urban areas, they are still poor, but they are much better than the origin areas. Similarly, at the receiving area, migration is considered as a burden because of the unemployment and harder to create the welfare states or increase in urban poverty. Similarly, the migration is as a threat, as a social or cultural integration, security, and religious cohesion. This slide actually tells about that how migration is a potential for rural migrants. We have studied that the migration movement critically strengthened the resilience of left behind family members, that the migrant and non-migrant family members, households, the migrant household are much better in their peer socioeconomic groups in terms of their socioeconomic indicators. So actually migrations help them to improve their livelihood and strengthen their resilience to climate change. Thank you, Manish.
Thank you, Mr. Salih. Some of your research revelations have sound implications on the complexity of climate change impacts on mobility patterns. Thank you for being here today. We would now like to move on to our moderated discussion with all the speakers. I would like to request all the speakers to kindly turn on their videos. I would be targeting some questions to specific speakers, and I would request you to keep your viewpoints relatively brief in lieu of time, but please feel free to chime in response to another speaker. We value audience engagement. I would like to encourage you all to use the Q&A function to post your questions as you witness this discussion. Before we start off with the panel discussion, I would like to draw attention to a poll question for the audience that will be on your screen shortly. We would love your participation with the poll. Please click on the option of your choice and then click submit so that your inputs are recorded. They're completely anonymous and the results will lead into an interesting discussion. Now, moving on to our panel discussion. Mr. Abhas, I would like to start with you. Channeling our understanding of climate change impacting human lives, I have a question that often seems to evade us. How can we, as ordinary citizens, make an impact or bring change in addressing climate change or its impending impacts on displacement? It is a systemic issue and could make one feel powerless in matters that are way beyond our reach, including institutional policies embedded to it. And here's an afterthought. Speaking of the design field where I thrive, my observation is that designers across disciplines are able to think deeply and strategically, understand problem solving. Can you shed some light on how these skills could be useful in the context of humanitarian interventions and where could they be used to fill in existing gaps? There are several young budding designers, architects, and planners listening as well. I would love to see if you have a message you could give them on areas of focus. Over to you.
Thanks, Nupur. That's a great question, but a very difficult one to answer. So I will say something that may be slightly unpopular and may not resonate with your audience. But frankly, personal responsibility is important. And, like not using single-use plastic and all that stuff, that's great, but that's not going to move the needle on climate. I'm sorry to deliver a blunt message, but that's not going to make a difference. What will make the difference is the political process. The governments need to change, need to invest, and that's where the real meat of this discussion should lie. So if your question is like, what as citizens can we do? Influence your politics, get engaged in your community, make sure that your member of parliament or your local body is taking the action necessary for serious climate action. And all the speakers had excellent examples of, for example, community-led action. Let's scale those up. Let's make sure that all the public expenditure that we do is climate informed. So let me give you an example with that. I think across South Asia, maybe with the exception of Bangladesh, I don't think our infrastructure investments are risk informed. So we're still building hospitals and schools in floodplains. We're still building schools and hospitals on seismic faults. I used to work in East Asia, and I remember that in Metro Manila, the biggest public hospital is right on top of the seismic fault. So if an earthquake were to happen, God forbid, that would be the first building to be destroyed. So these are simple fixes that are not frankly very hard to do, but it needs a bottom-up pressure to make them happen. Now, your second question is again an excellent one. As designers and planners and architects, what should you do? And my simple answer is get engaged. We desperately need your skills. Across the subcontinent, we need much more risk-informed land use planning, for example, which is not happening. The World Bank did a report on urbanization in South Asia a few years ago, and the process was described as messy, within inverted quotes. And that's true, right? Most of the urban growth is happening in a haphazard, unplanned manner. And frankly, we are building up the risks Our cities are becoming urban disaster hotspots. So we desperately need good planners, good designers to take care of this risk. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Jha. I would also like to move this question over to Ms. Runa Khan, who works on the simple logic, empathy, respect, and deep sense of justice and innovation. Can you add something to the same question?
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Abhas, because there were some very interesting ideas which you put forward. I want to just bring in a little bit of a warning for the young architects. You know, I work with possibly one of the best architects in Bangladesh. Best because he is really somebody who is very empathetical to the causes for why we do a solution. You know, why we are wanting a certain building. You know, we won the Aga Khan Award for architecture for one of our buildings, and it's very eco. Our schools, our plinths, and as you said, that we work with keeping in mind nature first. So just to come back, we fill the gaps. We do not come in with preconceived ideas of what we want to do. I ensure the architect doesn't, the engineers doesn't. We go there, we sit, we listen, we think. We look at the geography, the environment. We think of the people's habit and the socio-economic conditions, and then we create solutions. You know, we have created so many solutions which are now integrated into the government models and concepts. Our cluster housing guideline is one of the first in the world to be done, you know, and we have done this it's a housing guideline for disasters. And you can find this in the Red Cross website also. So it is all taken from solutions which need to be worked with, not coming in with innovation and technology, but rather with a human soul to see where the gaps are so as to fill the gaps. And this is extremely important, I feel. And I think any young architect, any engineers who are going in for this, don't come in with a preconceived idea of what you have to do or technologies you want to use, but rather see, listen, and then work with the communities to see what is really needed. And that is how it can become sustainable. We stopped, literally, our schools are all dismantleable. Our cyclone shelter is though made with cement, which is not very environmentally good, but as a cyclone shelter, it works in a certain way, which is extremely impactful. Our hospital services, school services are all built on mobility, using things and architectural and designs which are integrated into the geography and the environment. So this is extremely important, I think, too.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Runa Khan. I would love to request the poll results to be displayed. Thank you all for participating in the poll. It's really interesting to see, isn't it, that green infrastructure has received the most votes. Maybe a further validation for all the designers and planners and architects on the call. But I would love to direct a question on this to Ms. Pasang. You work with traditional and indigenous knowledge and that have a huge contribution in environmental protection. Can you share your views on traditional knowledge and modern science and technology moving parallelly to help the climate vulnerable?
Yeah, thank you, Nupur, for your question. This is actually the cry out of indigenous people around the world. That, as I shared also in the presentation, that indigenous knowledge and value system has hardly been considered as a part of the knowledge system or as part of the education, either in the school or in the university, or either as a part of the climate change education or materials. To deal with this climate change education and materials to impacts of the climate change already been discussed in the global levels, that why it is important to have balance with the indigenous knowledge and cultural practices, because as I said that already the different research and publications and even the Western science already identified that the continuation of the Western values and continuation of the Western part of kind of knowledge and modernizations would not have a sustainable solution unless and until we hear the voice of the local values, they hear the voice of the indigenous peoples and local communities and role of women's on the ground, how they have been sustaining their resources and contributing to reduce the impacts of climate change through their livelihoods and strategies. So this is a very important part, because in the communities that the role and contribution has hardly recognized in the discourse of the climate change. But now it's already started with along with the platform of the local communities and indigenous peoples platform of the UNCCC already started, that now this is the time that we need to balance the indigenous knowledge with the science knowledge. And then I personally also already started working with other science bodies, also working as authors of the IPCC in different forums, including the UNCCC's facility working group, that now the whatever we do for our development or dealing with the climate change resilience, climate change adaptation and mitigation, now this is the time that we balance the indigenous knowledge and the modern science. In the absence of the indigenous knowledge, now we will not have any solution. So that our children on the ground will not leave our village to the city and city to the America or the Western countries. The trend of what we have been experiencing is so unsustainable, because if you go to the village, if you want to talk to the young generation, they want to come to the city. If you talk to our young generation in the city, they want to go to Western countries. Why? Because of our education system has been driven in such a way that we're undermining our indigenous knowledge. Now we want to have a balance our livelihoods, balance our education, balance our knowledge system. That will help one with the solution to the impacts of climate change.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that really powerful answer. I would love to direct a question from the audience to Mr. Kashif Salik. Something that Ms. Pasang Dolma really touched upon right now was about inclusivity. What are your views on initiating a government intervention program with direct involvement with local village bodies? Like, can you shed some light on how this would work in Pakistan, or has this worked, or are there ventures really taking place where people at the grassroots level are really involved with government's inclusion and intervention?
I think it's a political economy question, and it is very much need of the time that the government should involve in with the people at the local level about their needs and their demands for the development, particularly development for their human capital. But unfortunately, what is happening in Pakistan that from many years, the local government is ineffective, or there is no local government elections. So local people voices are not reaching it really at the policy level, at the decision-making level. So there is a huge gap actually that need to be taken care of by the government and also the provisional government. So I think that gap actually they widen the information actually, which is very crucial for the climate change adaptation, or to reduce risks, particularly when there is where there is a climate extreme events such as floods and droughts, and we see that still the government is ineffective in understanding the great climate change impacts that very much impacting the local people. So I think still the government is not involved with the local population, and that need to be taken care of, and with respect to the local solutions, I think it's very important for interaction or integration of government efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Salik. I think you're very right that through a structural understanding of the environment in the broader political and cultural and the policy context of a region or country, can we begin to understand the role it plays and as a factor in population movement. This again brings me to my next question about gender, geographic vulnerabilities, and survival. If women can be empowered, it means that society can be strengthened, social taboos and conservation take a backseat. An observed phenomenon is male out-migration in search of better livelihoods and to provide for the family. Vulnerabilities are also imposed upon women and even children. I would like to direct my question to Mr. Kumar. Can you shed light on the desired agency for this section of the population, for the women and for women empowerment that you also work under, in deepening asymmetries and the need for the shift of mindset? And as a case study, if you could divulge in details of a specific example from your work.
Because we work in a particular context, which is both conflict as well as natural migration. Because of disasters, natural disasters. But I think it's not impossible to bring out women and bring about those changes in the society, because we have been doing significant number of work with both men and women. Because at the end of the day, I believe that in Afghanistan, if you want to, or maybe anywhere else, if you want to bring about changes in the lives of the women, to bring about some structural changes, you have to also work with men. Yeah. But we have also seen that as and when I think there is significant economic benefits that accrues to women, their situation in the family definitely goes up. Yeah. So what we have done, particularly through adaptation measures, we have tried to sort of identify work that women, quote unquote, specifically can do, particularly in this context. And we started working with them in weaving gabion structures. Yeah. To ensure that, I think to prevent landslides and to also ensure that, we are working around making the degraded land, I think work for the poor. So now I think they have come back as a group. What started just as a project, the women have come together as a group, and they are actually producing gabion not only for NGOs but also for commercial organizations. So that is one of their income sources. That is one. I believe that in our context, income in the family, contribution to the family income definitely brings about some dynamic changes inside the whole family structure. Because unless we bring about changes in the family, we cannot talk about social change.
Yes, thank you. That was quite visionary. I would like to also, that brings me to another question I have on mind, which kind of ties well with an audience question as well. I would like to bring you in again, Mr. Jha. My question is, we've spoken about technology. We have kind of spoken about and asked a poll question, which included the audience on it. Technology is one thing, access to technology is another. How do we overcome the need for access to technology as a service in areas of geographical remoteness and exposure to environmental volatility? This ties into an audience question that also came in. Considering that data is now becoming a source to solve a lot of our day-to-day problems, what initiatives have been taken by the World Bank to make data as a source to impact the work on climate change? And also, do we have enough data?
Thanks, Nupur. Those are all great questions. These are such complex issues that there's no single simple answer to this, right? So technology is not going to be a panacea which is going to solve all our problems magically. Technology will certainly be part of the solution, but it's not going to be the only thing, right? So we need to keep that in mind. I read a quote somewhere that COVID-19 was like an X-ray of our souls. It kind of laid bare all the divisions in society that underpin, like the poor and the rich, the people who have jobs that you can do on Zoom, and the people who are essential workers who need to. So in a sense, we need to have a holistic view of the problem of that climate change poses for our society, and then we need to address all of these divisions. So no amount of technology is going to solve, for example, the problem of growing inequality in our societies, and that is also a big driver of migration. People maybe I might have a slightly different take on some of our speakers, in that I think that moving from rural to urban is not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually a good thing, because cities are generators of good jobs and opportunities, and people move because they want better opportunities for themselves, for their families. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. But the question is that how do we create these millions and millions of jobs, good paying jobs that are required for the future? And there, I think technology is going to play a good role in that. So let me give you an example. We talk about the new economy. And the new economy will be powered by solar and by wind and by hydrogen fuel cells. We need the skills, we need the people who are going to, fabricate the windmills and maintain them and repair them. And that has to be underpinned. We have to plan to create those skills. So I guess that's my answer, in that, yes, technology will be part of the solution, but we need to think across all dimensions of the problem, not just one. Now, coming to your question of data, that's again a very important issue. The World Bank has an open data policy. So in the sense that all the data that is produced within the work we do is put in the public domain. And the reason we do that is that we want people to access it, and we want people to use that, build APIs of it, and do more and more creative work through that. But the answer to the second part of your question is that no, there are big data gaps currently that we need to work on. So take the example of climate vulnerability. You can look at like 10 different data sets, and it will tell you that Bangladesh is number 2, but in some other measure it's number 4 or number 6. So we need some standardization of certain things, like emissions per capita. How much do cities emit? Most cities in South Asia don't have a decent greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Air pollution is such a huge problem, but very few cities have a really good grip on what are the sources of air pollution, what is causing the problem. So those are the kind of things that we need to work on, and certainly data is very, very central. Thank you.
If I may interrupt for 1 second, if I may add something here for data. I always have real difficulty in often working with our researchers because of right questions being asked and finding people who actually are collecting the data. Because you can have the best mechanics of data analysis in the world. If your guy who is collecting the data is sitting under a banana plant and writing out your answers, you don't get the right solutions. And this is happening. And we need to find a solution right from there when you talk about data to the computers which are analyzing the data. So that's one thing. And then also have, be able to ask questions which are different in different contexts. I remember once, it's a small story, going to this village which is supposed to be having, which has 2 children per head. It was kind of an example of 2 kids per head. And I see so many kids, not enough grown-ups. So I actually asked this woman, you have 2, how many kids do you have? 2. Everybody is having 2 kids. Where are so many kids coming from? And then I asked, do you have any who are married? She's got 2 married kids. She's got 1 in the house as an infant. Nobody counts them. So it's difficult there. And management needs to be done. And then analysis needs to be done on reality. And also technology. Technology. You go to a place where they don't get enough to eat. They don't have healthcare. There's not even a little shop in the village to buy basic products. And then you have international organizations coming in with technical solutions, which are really gimmicks. I've gone through this, so I can tell you this strongly. They're really gimmicks, basically. So you need to find something, a solution, which is extremely simple, because the users of the solutions must be able to use them optimally and be able to ensure the continuity of that usage. Otherwise, there's no learning to the second step. So these are things which we need to take, in context very much when we talk about global issues. It all starts from that micro one individual.
Could I jump back in? Sorry, this is excellent. Runa, I really like your points. And if I could very quickly share with 2 stories from my own career, which might illustrate what Runa was just saying. And I hope I don't get into trouble by sharing some of these stories. So I started my career in the Indian Administrative Service. And as part of that, as a training, you're sent to as a block development officer. The block is the absolute bottom of the hierarchy. So you do 3 months as a block development officer. And this was in 1991. So part of my job was to supervise the census. The census happens every 10 years. So I supervised the census in my block. And I was this young green officer who didn't know anything. I was absolutely, and then I saw how the census is done. And that, let me just say that, that taught me to be very skeptical of data that comes out, because, the process, when you see the sausage being made, you don't really trust that. And the second point about that Runa made again is that in the Aceh tsunami, you had hundreds of these NGOs and governments working, and often at cross purposes. And they found that they couldn't get the data out from the frontline workers, because the frontline workers thought, frankly, that this reporting is a waste of their time. The reports that were being generated had no value to the people who were doing the work. Absolutely. So then what they did, which was a very smart thing, was that they went to the frontline workers and said, what kind of data would be helpful for you? And once they figured that out and they started generating those reports, then they started getting valuable data. So I think Runa's point, which is a very good one, is that you have to start with the people in the trenches and ask them that, what do you need? Rather than starting with the question that what do I need, for some central bureaucracy. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This was quite an engaging conversation. You brought up a lot of really good points, and it really is true that we have a lot of gaps that exist digitally to solve this issue, because it is a very complex, geographically vulnerable condition with nuances that are not solved with the same solution for every place or even within the same region. I would love to target this geographical gap into something more, digital gap into something more geographical. How can countries work together? And I think it will be inevitable for countries to work together when the borders are going to be but a blur reminder of our differences in a land. If the geography of the earth sinks a lot of places, demarcations are not existent anymore. If climate change, sea level rise gets as bad that we do not have maps that look like the same way it does today. This ties into a question from the audience as well. What kind of international cooperation or international refugee migration and the role of these institutions is to respond in a constructive manner for all the countries? And this is an open question, so please feel free to take the floor for any of the panelists.
Hi, Nupur. I think maybe it's not really directly relevant, but I have seen one question that for me, and I also okay. So there's more question, but maybe I will try to respond some of the question, and
Sure.
Also that is already been posted in the questionnaires.
Sure,
So
I'll hold it on standby. If you can repeat the question you're answering for, that would be great.
yeah, I think Mita and Dronacharya. So yeah. So they're asking us like what are the efforts that the documentation of indigenous people started in Nepal, and also problems of Nepali societies that can be something like that. I don't see all, but anyway, so the one of the main issues, as I said earlier, also because of our understanding, our approach, our concept, our values, where we are prioritized. I understand the earlier speaker also, like, it's no problem for coming of the people from the community to the city. It's no problem because of education, health, and there are a lot of opportunities. The problem is like the trend, if the trend of, moving, migrating all the youth and the men from the community to the city, and from city, the Western country, or either for employment opportunities or there's education or different purposes, but the trend has been moved in such a way that going back to your village, going back to your country is very decreasing rate. This is the main problem of the migration. Either it's because of the climate change or because of the other issues of education like that. But because this is one of the most important part of filling the big gap, increasing the gap of not moving to your village or not moving to your countries, is one of the, this is most important, is our concept, how we are bringing our concept, our values to our young generation through our education. You see our education system that is always prioritizing the Western values of the modernization or capitalistic worldviews. So this has created really havoc in a way that it's very difficult even us to breathe. That unless and until that we think about it to deal with this one, I think in a long run we'll have a really problem. So this is the problem that already experiences by the science or the science. So that is one of the reasons why we have a platform to discuss on this one, to be replicated at the national levels and even in the community level through our education, through our materials for awareness raising, building the capacity. That I understand earlier speaker also why it started from the bottom line approach rather than top down approach. This is the why. This is the one of the important is to balance, balance this one. And then another question I come to back with the efforts is already started at the global level. A national level Center for Indigenous People Research and Development, separate where I'm working now at the moment. We have already started working with the different organizations and also with the academic sectors in different internationally, nationally, on the documentation and the promotion, not only documentation, but also raising the awareness and building the capacity of indigenous peoples, the local authority, the elected bodies to act at least locally laws to acknowledge the role and contribution of indigenous people. The indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, the role of women need to be addressed in our local act and local laws. That will be promoted for our developing our education curriculum, so that our children will be already aware that how important the wealth of knowledge we have to protect, and before it is disappeared to be transferred to the future generation. We have already started, but it's not completed. We need more governments, we need more bilateral, multilateral, different bodies to join hands this mission, so that we'll have a balanced earth and we'll have a sustainable future for our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fasang, for taking on an audience question. I would like to circle back to the question about international cooperation and the role of international institutions in climate change migration. I would like to call upon Mr. Salik and Mr. Kumar, if you wanted to address this question.
Yes, thank you very much. I think particularly, this is Sudipta here, and particularly in Afghanistan, which is a landlocked country. And as we spoke about, in 2018 itself, 30% of the internally displaced people due to climate were in 1 year, okay? And obviously being a landlocked country, and they will obviously, an IDP has a big potential to migrate out, yeah? Number one. Number two is, this is one area, where, you cannot overemphasize the need of international cooperation. Because obviously Afghanistan is not producing a lot of carbon dioxide, yeah? It's not an emitter, big emitter, but the impact is very, very high, yeah? So unless, I think the policy people have to talk about it, probably Mr. Jha, more to, I'm just directing this question to him also, but obviously countries have to cooperate, yeah? Because at the end of the day, while migration, we're all migrants, yeah? I came from India here as a migrant, yeah, in a way, but I came not for push factors, yeah? So what is most important is, we try to sort of prevent the push factor migration by ensuring that, I think there are issues that are not only addressed programmatically, and again, I would agree with Mr. Jha on this. We can only do small programs, yeah? I think those need to be really used to scale up and advocate with the government to scale up, yeah? So this is what, I always believe that, I think there has to be international cooperation, because migration is not only internal, it is also international, yeah? And every country has to face that.
Thank you, Mr. Kumar. Mr. Salik, would you like to have the last word on that?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting discussion is going on. My observation in the field is that actually the climate change actually trigger internal migration initially, and then it gets started into moving population into the international migration. So I think in international organizations, particularly the research and development organization, need to think that how first we need to understand that the phenomena that what are the processes in which these people are moving, because as already mentioned by the speakers that of course climate change migration is a very positive thing, and I also believe that it is very rewarding in terms of then people moving. But the climate change induced migration is not so much rewarding, because the people when move from the rural to urban areas, they are resourceless, they have no livelihoods, they have no finances to live on in the destination area, so they are in a very miserable situation. So I think, and then they have to build on, and that's what happened. You can see that in COVID-19 situation, that these migrants, especially particularly the climate-induced migrants, are not well integrated into the urban areas, and that's what happened. And the COVID situation happened, and there's a mass migration returnees to the rural areas again, and the rural areas become again the center of hope for the migrant returnees. So that's phenomenon need to be understood. So I think there is need for more research, in a sense that how it is this internal migration can trigger into the international migration, and that in a mass level. So that rate or the trend need to be understood and then need to be monitored in a regular manner, I think. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all who answered, took questions, and shared thought-provoking statements. I kind of really enjoyed the cohesiveness within this panel itself in addressing some concerns, agreeing, disagreeing. Migration is a complicated issue, and often not just climate migration, but socio-political and economical migration really act as other triggers for migration. And the burden of assisting and protecting displaced populations cannot be allowed to fall on the shoulders of the most affected states or people alone. Climate change will exacerbate the situation unless vulnerable populations, especially the poorest, are assisted in building climate-resilient livelihoods. Swasmai sarvam, prakritiye sarvasvam. Everything of mine is dedicated to nature. Let this meaningful verse in Sanskrit be a reminder that the resources on the earth are all but a loan to mankind. I would like to leave you all with this thought in mind and hope that you have enjoyed and taken valuable insights from this session. I am immensely grateful to all the panelists for their gracious participation and inputs, and for keeping up with my emails. I am grateful to the entire team of Design Impact for tirelessly working towards making this event a possibility across the globe. Thank you so much. And I hope you all continue to think, act, and react for climate change and activism. I now hand it over to Alpa Nawre for closing remarks.
Thank you, Nupur. The thoughts and discussions that have been shared today will resonate with all of us for quite some time, and I want to thank all of you for being here. I also want to take this moment to express my gratitude to all of our partners shown here who have helped promote this event and make sure that it reached to people far and wide. Thanks are also due to Hunter Tura of Syndicate Sub Rosa and his team of talented designers. To our fabulous Associate Dean for Development at the GSD, Peggy Burns, and her dedicated colleagues, Brad, Lindsay, Pamela, James, and Laura, who make these events possible. To my Alumni Council colleague, Anna, for spearheading this initiative, and to a fantastic team of event organizers whose faces you have not seen today, but who are hard at work even as I speak. Thank you. And finally, I'm delighted to share information with you about the next event in the Design Impact series, Regeneration, Design Strategies for a New Future, on March 31st, 2021. Please keep an eye out for registration details on the Design Impact website, and hope to see you again then. With each successive event, we strive to improve upon these conversations that are so critical to building a culture of agency and action. And in that spirit, I request you to share your comments with us through a post-event survey that you will receive shortly. The conversations today have clarified many issues and raised other questions that strike at the core of design relevance, its operational capacity and limitations, and gaps in disciplinary knowledge on issues beyond Western realms of investigation in a staggeringly unequal world. The Alumni Council of the Harvard Graduate School of Design looks forward to continuing such conversations with your engagement and collective as well as individual action. For now, we take your leave. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye.